The Vanishing Backpacker in Bolivia. In 2008, Sam Turner, a 24-year-old from London, was on the adventure of a lifetime. After graduating from university, he decided to travel across South America, soaking in the culture, landscape, and challenge of the continent's most extreme trails. Sam was no stranger to hiking. He had trekked across the Swiss Alps, hiked through the Appalachian Mountains, and even survived a night lost in the jungles of Costa Rica. His latest challenge was one of the most infamous roads in the world, Bolivia's El Camino de la Muerte, better known as Death Road. The road earned its chilling name for good reason. It is a narrow, dirt path that clings to the side of steep cliffs, dropping hundreds of meters into the abyss below. Fog frequently rolls over the mountains, obscuring visibility, and the road's lack of guardrails only amplifies the danger. Thousands of people had lost their lives on this treacherous stretch since it was built in the 1930s. Still, for adrenaline seekers like Sam, it was a rite of passage. Sam had joined a group of other travelers for a guided cycling tour of the road. The tour promised a thrilling and unforgettable experience, which it certainly delivered. The day they set out, the weather was unusually grim. Thick clouds swallowed the peaks of the Andes, and a steady rain had turned the already dangerous path into a slick, muddy challenge. But Sam, always up for an adventure, was unfazed. The group had been cycling for a few hours when they reached a clearing, a small plateau that offered a brief reprieve from the perilous cliffs. Nearby, a waterfall cascaded down the rocks, shrouded in mist. Sam was intrigued by the sight. His guide had mentioned the waterfall earlier, warning the group not to venture too far off the road. Local legends spoke of strange happenings around the waterfall, stories of travelers who had gone missing, of an ancient spirit that lurked in the jungle. But Sam wasn't one for superstition. He saw the waterfall as a perfect detour and decided to explore while the rest of the group took a break. "I'll be back in an hour," he called over his shoulder, already walking toward the dense jungle that bordered the road. His friends watched him go, laughing about how Sam never seemed to get tired. But as the minutes turned into hours and the sun began to dip below the mountains, their amusement turned to worry. Sam was nowhere to be seen. By nightfall, panic had set in. The guide tried to reassure them, saying that Sam had probably just lost track of time. But deep down, everyone knew something was wrong. They sent out a search party the next morning, combing through the jungle near the waterfall. They found nothing, no sign of a struggle, no broken branches, no footprints. The only clue was a torn piece of Sam's backpack, snagged on a thorny bush near the base of the waterfall. Days turned into weeks, and still, no trace of Sam was found. Authorities expanded the search, but eventually, they had to call it off. Sam had disappeared without a trace. Months later, a hiker exploring a nearby cave system stumbled upon something chilling. Deep inside one of the caves, hidden from view, was a small, makeshift camp. Scattered around were a few personal belongings, an old water bottle, a map, and a journal. The journal, covered in dirt and mold, was Sam's. The final entry in the journal, written in a frantic, uneven hand, read, "I hear it at night. Something is out there. Watching. Waiting. I can't leave." Local legends about the waterfall speak of La Sombra, an ancient spirit that is said to lure people away from the path, only to trap them in the jungle forever. Some believe that Sam fell victim to the spirit, while others argue that the treacherous terrain claimed his life. Regardless of the cause, Sam Turner was never seen again, and the mystery of his disappearance remains unsolved to this day. The Hitchhiker of Route 66. In the late 1970s, Hank and Jane Davidson were a young couple living in Illinois, full of dreams and ambition. After getting married, they decided to take a road trip across the U.S., following the legendary Route 66, which ran from Chicago to Los Angeles. It was a spontaneous, romantic idea, a chance to see America in all its raw, untamed beauty. They packed their bags, filled their old Chevy with gas, and set out on their journey. By the time they reached Arizona, they had been on the road for nearly a week. The landscape had changed from green fields to endless stretches of desert, broken only by the occasional gas station or diner. They were traveling at night, hoping to avoid the scorching desert heat. The road ahead was empty, the sky above a vast expanse of stars. The only sound was the steady hum of the engine and the occasional static from the radio. As they cruised through a particularly desolate stretch of road, they saw her. A lone figure stood by the side of the highway, her silhouette illuminated by their headlights. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with long dark hair that whipped in the wind. She wore a simple white dress, almost too thin for the cool desert night. She stood there, her thumb outstretched, silently asking for a ride. "We can't just leave her out here," Jane said, her voice filled with concern. Hank hesitated. Something about the woman unsettled him, but he couldn't explain why. It wasn't unusual to see hitchhikers along Route 66, people looking to escape, to start fresh somewhere far from home. But this felt different. There was something off about the way she stood, so still, almost like a statue. But Jane insisted, and Hank, not wanting to argue, pulled over. The woman approached the car slowly, her movements deliberate. She climbed into the back seat without a word, her face blank and expressionless. "Where are you headed?" Hank asked, trying to make conversation. The woman glanced at him through the rearview mirror, her dark eyes reflecting the faint glow of the dashboard. "Just up the road," she said softly, her voice barely audible. As they drove, Hank tried to engage her in more conversation, but her responses were short, vague. Jane turned around in her seat, attempting to chat, but the woman seemed uninterested, staring out the window at the empty desert. After about 20 miles, they passed a dilapidated gas station, its rusted sign swaying in the wind. Hank glanced in the rearview mirror, only to find the back seat empty. The woman was gone. He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt on the deserted road. Both Hank and Jane frantically searched the car, opening doors, checking under seats. There was no sign of the woman. She had vanished, leaving no trace behind. Shaken, they drove to the nearest town, stopping at a diner to collect themselves. They told the waitress about what had happened, expecting to be met with disbelief. But instead, the waitress just nodded knowingly. "You're not the first ones," she said. "People have been picking her up for years. She's been dead for a long time." The woman, they learned, had died in a car accident on that very stretch of Route 66 decades earlier. Locals say she appears to travelers, seeking a ride home, but she never makes it. Some say she's trapped in a loop, eternally wandering the highway where she lost her life. Hank and Jane cut their road trip short after that, unable to shake the memory of the hitchhiker who had vanished without a trace. The Hostel of Nightmares in Budapest. In the summer of 2012, four college friends, Liam, Sarah, Ethan, and Rachel, embarked on a backpacking trip across Europe. They had been planning the trip for months, eager to experience the thrill of exploring new countries and cultures on a tight budget. Their journey took them from the rolling hills of Tuscany to the bustling streets of Paris, and finally to Budapest, the Hungarian capital known for its rich history and vibrant nightlife. Budapest was one of their last stops, and they wanted to make the most of it. However, as college students with limited funds, they decided to stay in a cheap, no-frills hostel in the heart of the city. The hostel, advertised as quaint and full of character, looked charming enough in the online photos, but when they arrived, they realized that the pictures had been taken decades earlier. The building was old, its once beautiful facade now cracked and faded. Inside, the atmosphere was even more unsettling. The hallway leading to their room was long and narrow, lit by dim, flickering lights. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and the creaky wooden floors echoed their every step. At the front desk, an elderly woman with deep-set eyes and a hollow expression checked them in. She spoke in a monotone voice, her eyes never quite meeting theirs. The room they were given was small and claustrophobic, with peeling wallpaper and a single, ancient-looking bed. The windows were barred, and the only light came from a bare bulb that hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the walls. Despite their unease, the group was tired from their travels and decided to stay. They figured they'd spend most of their time exploring the city anyway. That night, as the city's vibrant nightlife raged on outside, the hostel was eerily quiet. Around 2 a.m., Rachel woke to the sound of something outside their door. It was a low, rasping whisper, barely audible, but persistent. She sat up in bed, her heart racing. The whispering continued, growing louder and more frantic. Gathering her courage, Rachel crept to the door and slowly opened it, peering into the dark hallway. At the far end of the corridor stood an elderly man, his hunched figure illuminated by the faint glow of the hallway light. His skin was pale and waxy, his eyes sunken into his skull. He muttered something under his breath, but the words were unintelligible. As Rachel stared, frozen in place, the man turned his head toward her, his mouth slowly twisting into a grotesque, unnatural grin. Rachel slammed the door shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She woke the others, her voice shaking as she recounted what she had seen. They tried to calm her down, dismissing it as a nightmare brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, they all felt the oppressive atmosphere of the hostel creeping in. The next morning, they hurriedly checked out, unable to shake the feeling that they had narrowly escaped something sinister. As they explored the city later that day, they mentioned the strange hostel to a local tour guide. His face went pale when they described the building and its eerie inhabitants. "That hostel," the guide said, his voice low. "It used to be a hospital during World War II. Dark things happened there. Experiments on patients. Most of them never left. Some say their spirits are still trapped in the building." The friends left Budapest the next day, their excitement for the trip replaced by a gnawing unease. The memory of that haunted hostel, and the figure that had stared at Rachel with those dead, hollow eyes, lingered with them long after they returned home.